Welcome to Rico 12. I'm Justin. I'm your host and an imperfect. Once again, proven that I'm beautifully imperfect, stumbling, bumbling, and a child of an absolutely powerful and perfectly loving God and an addict. Rico 12 is all about exploring the common threads of addiction and sharing tools and hope from those on a similar path. We gather from diverse backgrounds, faiths, and places to learn and support one another. Our speakers represent various fellowships, addictions, and afflictions, thus showing the common threads of recovery no matter our addiction. Today's speaker for the 278th meeting is Gwen W., a first-time Rico 12 speaker. Her chosen topic today is How the 12 Steps Change Us from the Inside Out, and I look forward to hearing her message here in just a few minutes. But first, for some business. Rico 12 has several recovery resources in our family of podcasts and social media communities. To learn more, listen more, connect more, or just hang out and learn and grow with us, you can check out the other podcasts. You can find those at www.rico12.com. That's RECO12.com. And you can join our social media communities from there, or you can send an email to me at rico12pod@gmail.com, and I can get you lined up there. I'll also put this information in the chat and in the show notes of the podcast. Rico 12 is self-supporting, and your contributions help us continue our mission. Specific thank yous go to Kristen and Liza this week for their generous repeat donations over the last year. And thank you to all of our spearheads for new and repeat contributors. We're super grateful for you. Your donations really help in this project. If you out there also feel the desire to become a spearhead and support this cause, please visit rico12.com/support. Or click on the links that I'll have in the chat here and in the show notes of the podcast for one-time or monthly donation options. Your support, not just financially, but with your word of mouth, makes a difference in keeping us able to share these messages of hope and recovery. We look forward each meeting to receiving from the light reflected from our speakers. That light inspires hope, meaning, worth, and growth in us, the listening audience. Now I'm going to introduce our guest speaker for today, Gwen W., and give a little background on her. Gwen spent almost 20 years going in and out of 12-step rooms, struggling to do her part to recover from her food addiction. After years of failing and relapse, she became suicidal. This scared her enough to make one final effort to find recovery. And she found it. The more Gwen focused her recovery efforts on a few basic practices outlined in the 12 steps, the better her understanding became of the recovery process. Finally, Gwen made her way to the other side of her food addiction. Today, Gwen is very passionate about teaching the simple addiction recovery framework found in the 12 steps that can lead to peaceful and permanent recovery. Take it away, Gwen. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Justin. I want to take just one quick minute. I know, coming from a background of a food addiction, I think sometimes that can be a little bit challenging, both in the addiction space and in the non-addiction space. In the last week, I've had somebody to say, hey, I get it. You like food, and I used to shoot up fentanyl, so I'm just having a little bit of a hard time relating. But also I had somebody who was almost 400 pounds say, yeah, you're saying you are a food addict. I can't relate to you. And so on both ends of the spectrum, sometimes I feel like it's a little bit hard to maybe find that home of where do we belong, as somebody who's struggling with a food addiction. But I have to tell you, for me, I think the question comes down to, is it going to kill you? Is it going to kill you physically? Is it going to kill you spiritually? Is it going to kill a relationship? Is it going to kill a career opportunity? And for me, I was in a situation where I was slowly eating myself to death, and I was going to die. I was either going to die by killing myself fast or killing myself slow. My health challenges continued to ramp up till I was over 300 pounds, pre-diabetic, and decided I just wasn't going to go see my doctor again because I didn't want to be diabetic, but I also couldn't do the things I needed to do to not be. I had several family members who died from complications with diabetes, so I knew I was moving toward a place where I was ultimately going to be eating myself to death, and it didn't matter what the cost was. It didn't matter what the prognosis was. It didn't matter what the threat was. It didn't matter things I had already lost. I was not able to stop. And so for me, it comes down to, what are you doing that you can't stop doing, even though you want to, even though you know better, even though you know you should? So for me, that journey took me into some 12-step rooms about 20 years ago. I'd started to binge eat after a series of cyclical traumas that continued for a period of time. So for me, I felt like I was always in this place where I was either managing an active trauma or managing the aftermath of a trauma, or preparing for trauma that I was pretty sure was going to happen again. And that's when I moved into binge eating. And it was in that space that somebody mentioned, like, maybe this is like this looks like an addictive behavior for you. And so I moved into a 12-step room that was specific for food addicts. And I found people telling my story, and I didn't feel alone, which was amazing. However, I did find a community of people who had my same story, which was really a relief to me. But at the same time, there weren't a lot of people who could explain to me what the program was or what the 12 steps were supposed to do. I just knew that I was showing up because I was trying to stop eating myself to death. And I was trying to control situations in my life that I couldn't control. And one of the early steps is, step 2 is you come to believe in a power that's higher than you, who can restore you back, to a place of wellness or sanity. And, that to me I thought that was going to be a very easy step because I had always believed in God. However, I didn't know how big the gap was between the God I thought I knew and the God who was trying really hard to let me get to know him. And so it was a series of trying and failing within a 12-step model where I was trying to do what I thought was asked of me. There were a lot of things that kind of were put in place to try to help me to control my life and help me to control what I was doing and not doing. And so, for instance, my first sponsor was like, well, you got to go to 90 meetings in 90 days before we even start the steps. And so that was a little bit of a challenge for me because at the time, especially, there weren't meetings every day for overeating or like food issues. And so I was, going to other meetings, and it was a challenge. And I have to tell you, for years and years trying to move through this step process and not being able to really kind of get it or get through it without moving back into my addiction, I would try to do steps and try to kind of build a dam against me and my addiction so that I could successfully move through the steps, because I thought that's what was required of me, is I do the work to build a dam. And then once I have that dam built, then my higher power can come into that space and he will be committed to helping me hold the dam. He will be able to help me be willing and able to white knuckle my way through my addictive urges and temptations and feelings for the rest of my life. And even though it didn't sound super comfortable, because I didn't want to have cravings, I didn't want to have urges, I didn't want to have to manage that anymore because I hate white knuckling it. It sucks. It feels horrible. But I believed that was the best that God could offer me. I believed that was the best that a 12-step program could offer me. And even though that didn't sound comfortable, and even though I didn't just want to be abstinent, I wanted to be happy in my abstinence. Even though that was the case, at least I felt like there was hope that I would be able to avoid, like I could get out of the bigger problem, which was, okay, well, at least I can be miserable in my abstinence, but not be in my addiction and creating all these other problems that I'm creating. At least I won't be slowly killing myself. At least I won't be, doing all these other destructive things associated with my addictive practices. And so that was as good as I thought the program could do for me, but it was going to just have to be good enough. And it definitely seemed like it would be better than what I was doing. And so, but then that was really hard for me because we've heard that phrase, once an addict, always an addict. We hear that all the time. And for me, what that said was, no matter what, I'm always going to have to live with this hole in my chest. This thing that makes me go into my addiction, I'm always going to have to live with that. And there's no hope to overcome that. So even though I felt like there was hope in overcoming my addictive behaviors, I didn't feel like there was going to be any hope in helping me overcome my addictive feelings. Those feelings that sent me to a place where I felt like I just needed that relief, and my addiction really helped me regulate that. And so that's where I stayed for a really, really long time. And I finally, I tried and failed within the 12-step model for so long. Like I said, I would pretty much get to step 3, white knuckle my way through my addiction, try to build that dam, because I'm like, I think that's when I'm supposed to give it up. None of the 12 steps say stop doing that thing, stop giving up your addiction. But step 3 does say give your will to God. And I'm like, well, how else can I show that than by giving up my addiction? Surely this is where I'm supposed to give it up. So I would try to give up my addiction in step 3. I would get into step 4, where you have to kind of drudge up all the pain in your life. And I didn't know how to move through that without moving into my addiction, because my addiction was what helped me to feel better. So if you're putting me into a place where I got to rub all the things that hurt in my life, how do I feel better? Well, I hadn't learned how to do that with my higher power yet. And so I would get into step 4 and then run, because like I said, I was either in active trauma moving through the fallout of an active trauma or preparing for another trauma. I was always in survival mode. And so I just couldn't move through step 4 without turning back to my addiction. And so I was in this perpetual cycle, trying and failing and trying and failing. And meanwhile, my health issues in my life was getting more and more out of control. And finally, I hit my last rock bottom a few years ago when I became suicidal, and I stayed up. I had the suicide hotline number pulled up on my phone. I was just praying that I wouldn't have to call before morning, because at that point I had tried to move through the 12 steps. Finally, I had tried to kind of make my way through them. But once I got to those maintenance steps of 10 and 11 and 12, I didn't know what to do with them. I wasn't using a sponsor at the time. In fact, I had started to go to a more general 12-step program that my church was doing that wasn't addiction specific. And they had a workbook. So I was trying to do that, just the 12 steps on my own. And steps 1 through 9 are very checklist oriented. I could quantify when I was done with them. And then, so I was getting excited. I got all the way through step 9 and I'm like, check, check, check. I've done some hard things. I feel good. I can tell that these steps are working because I feel a lifting, spiritually and emotionally. But then when I got to step 10, I was really excited because I'm almost there, 10, 11, 12. And then I'm done. I'll be cured, right? Well, I turned the page, I get to step 10 and I was like, I don't know really how to do step 10 or step 11 or step 12, because for me, the way that step 10 was kind of framed out was well, this is where you maintain your daily accountability. And I'm like, well, if I could maintain my accountability, I wouldn't be in the mess I'm in. Step 11 was to, that conscious contact with God. I'm like, well, I think I'm already doing it and it's not doing a whole lot for me. I'm still in my addiction. And then step 12 was to share your message, after having that spiritual awakening. But I'm like, but I have had it. I'm not recovered. I didn't know how to do 10 and 11 and 12. And so that's where I really started to hit rock bottom for me, because all of those years that I was moving through a 12-step program and trying and failing and trying and failing, I held out hope that as soon as I do it, I'll be fine. As soon as I can get through all 12 steps, I will recover. I'll be cured. I kind of held it in my back pocket like a blank check that I'll cash on Monday. I'll cash at the new year. I'll cash next month. Eventually, I'll be ready to go through all 12 steps. So when I finally did it and made my way through the 12 steps, it didn't do what I thought it was going to do. I thought I'd get to step 12 and be cured and be done. And I wasn't, and I didn't know how to do it, And so that's when I really hit rock bottom and spiraled, because I was like, that was my last hope. And it wasn't that I didn't believe the 12 steps could help me or that God could help me. I still believed that 12 steps could do the thing I needed it to do. I still believed God could do something in my life, but I didn't feel like I had what I needed in order to make it happen. I didn't feel like the program was failing me. I felt like I was failing me. And that I didn't feel like God was failing me, that I was failing to do my part. I just couldn't do that part that I had to do in order for the program to work, or in order for God to do what he needed to do for me. Like I said, going back to that idea of, I thought I had to build a dam against me and my addiction, and then God could show up and help me be willing and able to white knuckle my way through that for the rest of my life. And I could never successfully build that dam or stay in a place where I even wanted to. That was my struggle, is wanting to want to do what I had to do. Because as soon as I took my addiction out of my life, then I'd start to fantasize about it. And as soon as I started creating that distance between me and my addiction, like I said, it just fed into my fantasizing about it. And when I'm fantasizing about my addiction, I'm just thinking about all the good parts. And so that's hard to compete. It's hard to compete with that lie, because what is that? The first 5 minutes of it, and then you exhaust yourself in that place of addiction. And then everything else that comes after is the fallout, and it sucks. But when you're not in it, it's easy to fantasize about the good parts. And so for me, I thought after I hit rock bottom, I went back to a program, because I was willing to do whatever it took to stay alive at that point. I was like, I just have to do what I have to do to stay alive. And that was when somebody introduced me to this idea, the right lineup of people and literature and experiences and timing, I guess, that just opened my eyes to this new idea that it wasn't about my addiction. My addiction wasn't about my addiction. I mean, to me, of course it was. I could point to everything in my life that was falling apart and being destroyed and say, yeah, it's the addiction. Yeah, it's the addiction. But someone suggested it's not actually about the addiction. If you just do the steps, if you just work the steps, the addiction will take care of itself. And that was a really new idea to me, because I thought that getting rid of my addiction was part of the steps. But that made me go back and read the big book and really study it. And as I read it and I really studied the steps, I was like, you know what? There isn't a single step that says stop doing your addiction. And so I had to reframe, what does it mean to give my will to God? Well, as I moved through the book and read it, before I'd even started doing the steps the final time, I just read through it. Well, what was step 10? Step 10 shows, well, now you're looking at your life and you're saying, I'm going to give God, I'm going to look for those times where I'm feeling really emotionally dysregulated, the times where I feel the selfishness coming in and the fear and the resentment, all of those things. I'm going to look for those in my life and give those to God as soon as they show up, because I know that's my problem. My problem are these things running amok and me just not knowing how to move through them or process them and trying to control things myself. So I started to reframe, what does it mean to give my will to God? And I realized that giving my will to God, it wasn't about giving up my addiction. My addiction only was a reflection of the things I would not give up to him, which was my willingness to let him be in control of my life. I started to learn that worrying only means I don't trust the person in charge. And I didn't trust God. I thought I'd lived my life from a place of trusting God as someone who had faith my whole life. But then I started to realize, no, I have never trusted God. I have only been trying to use God my whole life. I thought, as somebody of faith, as somebody who was trying to show up and do good things in my life, that I had the right to show up and give God the blueprint of my life and say, here, make it happen. So whereas I'm like, yeah, I'm not in control. Yeah, I can't make things happen. Well, good thing I have a God on my side who is in control, who can make things happen. And I expected him to. I thought I could give him the blueprint of my life and say, make it happen. And then sit back and be like, yep, hands off. I'm letting God take care of it. When in reality, I was just expecting him to put things in place the way I foresaw them. And so I spent my life being angry and worried and sad and mad and scared and anxious and all of these things because things weren't going my way. When we talk in the book, when it talks about us trying to be the director and trying all these different ways to try to be the director and realize like, this is just not going our way. For me, that was like a huge aha and a huge wake up to realize that surrendering to God was not about giving him my addiction, that my addiction only was a clue and a litmus test of where was I with all the other stuff God was asking me for. And what he was asking me for was to really give him my will. What he was asking me for was to really say, I'm going to take my hands off the steering wheel and trust you to do your job so that I'm free to do my job. And I had to figure out, well, what's my job then? Because all my life I'd been trying to do God's job and comment on his job and waiting for him to do his job the way that I was asking him to do it. I was trying to be God's boss instead of God's servant. And so what I started to realize as I worked the 12 steps, and like I said, I read the big book that last time and I hit my rock bottom. I started with first reading the big book, first trying to understand what the 12 steps were so I could understand where I was going before I started. And once I did that and read through all of those steps and just those few chapters, it's just 5, 6, and 7, 3 chapters that talk about what are the 12 steps, what is it we're trying to do, and where are they going to get us. I was reading things in the big book that talked about being like, you don't crave alcohol. You don't crave your addiction. You feel a neutrality towards it. And that's the miracle. And to me, I had always believed that was outside of my reach. I didn't know that was something that I could hope for because I had always been told once an addict, always an addict. So I thought I was just going to have to live around this pain in my chest, this hole in my chest for the rest of my life. I didn't know it was possible to be abstinent and happy and relaxed and peaceful in my abstinence. But when I read those chapters, I realized what they're talking about is the loss of this obsession, not the successful management of it, but like it can be gone. And like I said, reading the text about step 10, that's when I really realized like, oh my gosh, like these steps is not about trying to control this monster in my chest. It's about doing the things and surrendering the things that God is actually asking me for so that that monster can go away. And so that's when I realized that 12 steps truly, truly are designed to change us from the inside out. But for years and years, for those 15, almost 20 years that I was moving through the 12-step rooms and 12-step programs, I kept getting tripped up because I was in this game of telephone with a lot of other well-meaning people, very well-meaning people, but I had become part of a long game of telephone of people who were trying to interpret the 12 steps the best they could based on how their sponsor did it. So then they were teaching it to somebody else and they did it the best they could based on how their sponsor did it. So they kept employing new techniques and new tools to try to control and manage the addiction. So I was told, go to 90 meetings in 90 days before you can even start the steps. I was told to control things on this way and on that way, and to let somebody else police what I was doing, and all of these things, all of these mechanisms for trying to control me from the outside in. And like any tools that we would use to try to achieve a goal in our normal everyday life. But what that did for me is it really circumvented the power of what the 12 steps were, because it wasn't until I got my hands on the original text and really came to understand where I was trying to go with this process, which was full neutrality, and not I'm controlling my addiction, so now I'm successful. But if I arrive at a place of neutrality towards my addiction, that's how I know I've moved through this process correctly, because I have surrendered the things in my life God's asked me to surrender, and in exchange, the obsession lifts. And that was amazing for me, because in my life, I found that I thought I was managing chronic depression and anxiety and trauma and being in survival mode and the stress of being a single mom and financial problems and a really long list of things that I was managing. And in addition to that, I also was managing my addiction and the effects it had on my health and the effects it had on my relationship, and this constant obsession morning to night thinking about it. And so to me, it was a really, really, really long list of things I was trying to manage. But once I started to recognize that my addiction only was a reflection of my proximity to God, that my addiction only was a reflection of where I was in my healing process, then I could see it as not this list plus this list, but it was, it solved half my problems overnight, because I was able to realize that my addiction only was a reflection of everything that was going on with me spiritually. And so instead of me feeling like I had this massive list of problems I had to solve, including my addiction and how I managed it and how it was affecting my life and my relationships and my family and my career, I realized that, okay, if my addiction is only a reflection of my spiritual proximity over here and my spiritual health over here and what I'm doing over here, if my addiction only is a reflection of what I have and have not yet surrendered to God, the things He's actually asking me to give Him, then that helped me to realize that I don't have to try to split my energy and my efforts trying to manage and control both of those things. So what I did is, after over 15 years of trying and failing to manage my addiction by trying to control my addiction and my addictive practices, instead, I really clung to the tenets of that step 10 promise. That is, we continue to give God our fears and our resentments and our selfishness, and we are vigilant about watching those and how they affect our life and how they encroach on our life, and give those to Him. That if you spend that time there, for me, I spent that time there, and instead of trying to manage my addiction, I spent all of my recovery minutes only trying to dial in that relationship I was having with God and trying to build with Him. I no longer, I felt, wasted my time trying to control my addiction, because that was just another mechanism of control. When the big book was telling me, you got to give up control. So I'm like, well, I'm going to stop trying to control it. I'm going to stop trying to control it. Instead, I'm going to just keep practicing giving up control, not of my addiction, but of my life. So what that looked like to me was, instead of waking up in the morning with a craving and trying to pray my way out of a craving and give that craving to God and give that desire to God, what I instead did is I woke up and said, I'm having a craving. That's a reflection of something I'm holding on to that doesn't belong to me. That means I'm trying to do God's job somewhere in my life. And so I would move into that reflection of the inventory. Well, where am I being fearful? Where am I holding on to fear? That it's not something I can hold anymore. It doesn't belong to me. Where am I holding on to resentment? I can't hold that anymore. It's going to kill me. Where am I being affected by selfish thinking? I can't afford to be affected by selfish thinking anymore. Where am I being dishonest? I can't afford to be dishonest anymore. And obviously, somewhere in there, I'm getting something wrong, because I'm having a craving. I'm having something over here. So I go through that as a two-way prayer and say, God, where's my selfishness, my fear, all those things, so He could help me recognize what it was that I was holding that I had to give Him. And as soon as I gave that to Him, my craving would go away. And I'll give you an example, because for me, really, and we can do that with steps 10 and 11 and 12, I'll give you an example. I had this experience about 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, maybe. Anyway, I was neutral in my addiction. I was doing really well. And there was this day that I had I had a thought. I'm like, oh, I should go get XYZ. I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I haven't thought about this in months. Where did this thought come from? And at first I was afraid. I was like, oh no, what if I've lost my recovery? Like, I've enjoyed this miracle for a minute, but now I'm having this thought like, oh no, maybe I've lost my recovery. But then I thought, no, no, trust the steps. I know that if I'm having a craving, if I'm having a temptation, it's something to do with the maintenance steps, 10 and 11 and 12. Because I realize that recovery, when you look at the 12 steps, they're kind of broken into two phases. So if you think of like a hoarder, if you wanted to do an intervention for a hoarder, the first thing you do is you show up to your friend's house with a big box of black trash bags and you start taking garbage out to the dump, right? And you would work tirelessly until you cleaned the house. And then you'd stand there in the middle of that beautiful clean house. But you know how long it would be clean? Probably about a day. Because the next day, the hoarder is the one who's going to have to move back into that house and live there. So unless that hoarder then learns the skill of daily pickup, there's no hope of that room staying clean. And so I've come to realize that the 12 steps are kind of divided into those two sets of practices. You have the first 9 steps, which really help you to get that deep clean. And then you have steps 10 and 11 and 12, which are really dedicated to help you learn those skills of daily pickup so that you don't get back to where you were. You don't want to keep continuing to hoard your fears and resentments and angers and selfishness and all that thing. So you need to pick them up on a daily basis so you don't get back to where you were before. And so for me, in this moment, going back to my story where I was in a place where I was having a thought, not even a craving, because I wasn't having cravings anymore, but the thought came to me almost like an intrusive thought, hey, go get this thing. I was like, no, no, no. If I'm having that, I know I'm holding something that doesn't belong to me. Steps 10 and 11 and 12, those are my resources for doing my daily spiritual and emotional pickup to make sure I don't go there. So where am I at? I'm like, well, where am I at with step 10? What am I holding on to? What fear, resentment, selfishness, dishonesty? And I realized like, oh, well, my transmission started slipping this morning and I'm terrified. I'm a single mom. What am I going to do if my car gives out? Yeah, I got to give this fear over to God for sure and just trust the outcome. So I did step 10. And then I'm like, well, where am I with step 11? Because I know 10, 11, 12. Check where you are with those. If those are dialed in, you won't have cravings. If they're not, then you will. So I'm like, step 11, conscious contact with God. And I realized that the last 3 nights in a row, I had been exhausted. I'd put my son to bed. And instead of putting him to bed and then going to my room and doing my meditations and prayers before bed, I had put my son to bed and fallen asleep with him. And in the middle of the night, woke up in his bed and then went over to my bed and didn't do all that stuff. So I'm like, 3 nights in a row, I didn't do my step 11 work. I didn't do my conscious contact with God. So where am I with step 12? Okay, I'm good with step 12. I'm doing some service. I'm doing reaching out. So I realized step 10, I had to dial that in. Step 11, I had to dial that in. I did. And the thought went away. And I don't think I've had a thought for that in the 2+ years since then. And so for me, I just to recognize that the 12 steps they are designed to help to change us from the inside out. And if we are in a place where we're trying to control our addiction or to manage ourselves from the outside in, at least for me, I stayed stuck and it was just not something that I was ever successfully able to do. Even though there might be periods of time that I could be abstinent for stretches of time, it was never something, that was comfortable, because I hated the white knuckling feeling. It was so uncomfortable, but also, so I could never feel the way I wanted to feel, even though my life might look the way I wanted it to look for a period of time. It never felt the way I wanted it to feel. And also, I just couldn't do it. I tried. And it wasn't until I worked the 12 steps in a way that I could understand what it was God was actually asking me to surrender and give that to Him and continue to maintain my recovery practice, not as a control mechanism of my addiction, but as a way to surrender my control of my life and give it to God, give it to God, give it to God by following the simple scripts and precepts that are in there, 10, 11, 12, 10, 11, 12. That I was able to find recovery. And in that process, as I did that, and I kept giving God an opportunity to show up and remove my fears and resentments and selfishness and dishonesty on a daily basis, what I saw is I experienced an emotional lifting and a spiritual correction. And then my addiction went away. Like I lost my interest in it because I was never able to actually give it up. I did both side by side. I did my addiction and that God thing side by side every day, and doing it and I'm not saying do it this way. I meant to give up my addiction and I just never could, but I continued to do the steps. Even though I couldn't do the let's give up the addiction thing, I just trusted if I continue to do 10, 11, 12, then that change will happen on the inside. And it did happen. And then it was reflected on the outside to where now even I still trust and recognize anytime there's a thought or craving. I don't really get cravings now, but if a thought might cross my mind or whatever, I'm just like, oh, that just means I have something, I'm holding something I have to give to God. I do the work. I ask God what it is. I recognize it. I give it to God, a fear usually or a resentment. And I do. And then it goes away. So it's really amazing. I keep my recovery work as an internal dialogue between me and God. And I live the best life. I love it. It feels good to be on this side of recovery. It feels better than I ever imagined because, like I said, I thought the best God could do for me was to make me willing and able to white knuckle my way through the rest of my life. And I don't white knuckle ever. It feels good. So that is my share today. Thank you so much, Justin. I turn the time back over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Gwen. Thank you for your energy, for your honesty, and for your willingness to share today. I got a lot out of that. I wrote down several questions. We have a question that's already come in from the live audience. And a reminder to our live audience, if you have a question for Gwen, you can type it in the chat, and I will go ahead and ask that. If you want to remain anonymous, if you don't want me to read your first name off, just send me the direct message through the chat or type anonymous in your post there, and I won't read your first name out as we do this. The first question that I have is a combination question. It's from somebody in our live audience, but it's also something that I wrote down. You mentioned that you didn't know, as you're going through the steps yourself without a sponsor, when you got to steps, 4, and then 10, 11, 12, you didn't know how to do that. You couldn't figure that out. First of all, how important is a sponsor in this process for you? And second, what does your steps 10, 11 look like today? You mentioned a little bit about that, but let's go into detail on that when you get there.
Sure. So I have to tell you, I have a little bit of an unpopular opinion about sponsors. I'm just going to answer your question very honestly. I used a sponsor. So after trying to do, I did move through step 4 successfully. Steps 1 through 9, I felt like I actually was able to get through pretty well through using the workbook because they were easy to quantify when I was done. And by looking at the material and doing it, but then also spiritually, I was like, yeah, I'm done. I get it. But 10 and 11 and 12 were really hard for me. And so when I went back to a 12-step program, I did go to one that was specific to my addiction with the explicit purpose of finding a sponsor who could hold me accountable and who could help me. Now, what I found through that process, I ended up using 4 sponsors across 18 months. No dramatic breakups. It was just we moved on for various reasons. The last sponsor was the only one that we had a conversation. I was like, I'm not doing this anymore. And I'll tell you what that looked like for me. In that 18-month period, though, I used 4 different sponsors. And what I thought I was having a different conversation with these 4 different women. In hindsight, I was able to see, actually, it was one long conversation I was having with God. And he just brought the next person in who needed to tell me the next thing. So with each sponsor, I learned something different. I was able to dial in the accountability part. Somebody who was there saying, send me your step 10s and send me your step 11s. There were, so I feel like I strongly counsel people, if you're going to use a sponsor, please just know that is not somebody who should ever be a gatekeeper between you and your higher power. First and foremost, the 12-step process, the 12-step program should be about you and God connecting intimately, and so that you can hear his voice and move based on what he's asking you to do. And so if you ever feel like you're working in a relationship with a sponsor who's trying to kind of act like the gatekeeper between you and God, or act like some mouthpiece for you, for God on your behalf, be wary of that. Because for me, I know that, it was, my understanding was that I had to do whatever my sponsor said in order to show my willingness to do whatever God said. I had to surrender to a sponsor to show my willingness to surrender to God. And I was not always asked to do things that were safe for me. I was sometimes asked and instructed to do things that kind of kept me stuck. And so really wasn't until I really learned to really dial that in with God and to make sure that as I did those steps, those daily steps of step 10, it wasn't just about sending a text to my sponsor. I actually literally had to ask God, remove this from me. That was the completion of that step. Same with step 11. It wasn't just telling a sponsor, I did these things. I had to move through the completion of that step, which was to actually connect with God and actually make that contact with him. And so I think for me, I benefited from using a sponsor in order to dial in that accountability. But I also have to recognize now in hindsight, none of my sponsors were actually recovered. And because they weren't recovered, there was a limitation to how far they could take me and what they were able to offer. So once I found recovery, I was like, how come nobody told me this or this or this? Like, how come they didn't say that? It would have made my journey so much easier. And I realized, like, well, they weren't recovered. That's why they didn't know those things. So they couldn't have shared that. So for me, I stopped using sponsor after about 18 months. I got into a place of complete neutrality, dialed this in really intimately with God. And I did not intend to stop using a sponsor. I actually thought I'd use one for the rest of my life because that's the model of the program as I understood it. And so but then I started to wonder though, because I started to feel like my sponsor didn't understand some things that I understood. So I started to kind of feel like maybe she's not recovered and I'm not sure that this is a really safe relationship. And also I felt like she was being a little more controlling and questioning my practices. Step 10 thing came up a lot. She would say, "You're not doing it right. You're not doing it right." And I'm like, I'm recovered and I'm doing it to the best of my abilities. I think I'm doing something right because I'm doing this. I know it's working between me and God. And so she got so controlling and she brought her sponsor in and they just were really controlling. I was like, I think I'm good. Like, I think me and God will continue forward from here. Like, I think God will continue to sponsor me from here. Now, I will say though, at that point, I had neutrality and a really good handle on things. So I'm not in any way trying to suggest don't use a sponsor. For me, I've opted to not use one for the last 2.5 years. And it's gone really well. I feel like me and God have dialed this thing in really beautifully. And I have arrived. And so for me, in my experience, I'm grateful for the sponsors I had. They made great training wheels to help me get to a place where me and God could continue forward on our own. That's just my own personal perspective and experience. Now, you asked about what do my steps 10, 11, 12 look like? I'll say this more succinctly. I know I'm talking a lot. My 10 and 11 and 12, I'm very, 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 very fluent in it. And so it's not as scripted as it used to be. When I was using a sponsor, the thing that I benefited most was that accountability and the scripts that kind of gave me a framework for how am I supposed to do this? What is the principle? What am I trying to achieve here? And so it was very script based. My step 10s looked a certain way. I said these things and I contacted my sponsor and all that. Same with step 11, very, very scripted. Same, and 12 was a little bit of a mystery, but I did it to the best of my ability. And when I do a 10 now, it's not as scripted because I'm so fluent in these things. It's something I do kind of naturally. Good example, last night, my son woke up or wasn't going to sleep and he was just causing kind of some havoc in the house because he wouldn't go to sleep. I stood in his room and I was so angry. I just wanted to go to bed and, his problem was becoming my problem. And I just in that moment was asking God to please take my resentment and help me to know what to do next. God, I'm really resentful. I know I'm trying to control a situation that is not mine to control. I'm trying to control an outcome. I'm being selfish. Please help me be kind to this kid and please take my resentment so I can move through this and know what's the next right thing for me to do. So that's my step 10 kind of in real time. I'm recognizing, and for me, I know when to do a step 10 because I'm not if I'm dysregulated, if I'm emotionally dysregulated, if I know I'm not comfortable. So it's like, oh, I'm dysregulated, what's going on? And I'll just quickly, where's my fear? Where's my resentment? If I don't know, sometimes I know, I'm like, I'm mad at my son because he's keeping me up. But sometimes I'm like, I just know I'm uncomfortable, but I don't know why. So I'll just kind of go inward for a minute and be like, okay, God, where's my fear, my resentment? How am I being selfish, dishonest? I identify it, give it to God. And then, in service, I would say I love service because that's a great way to move out of obsession. Service, I think, is always a good, when in doubt, do service. It will always create movement. So if I'm in a place where I'm feeling dysregulated spiritually or whatever, and I'm not really sure what's going on and I don't know what to do next, service is always a fail-safe way to kind of move me into the next thing. So 10, that's how I do my step 10s kind of in real time. Step 11, I just have a practice to, each day, that conscious contact with God. It's not as scripted as it used to be. But also it's back to where it was before, where I have daily practices where I make sure that I'm making that contact with God. So for me, I feel like 10 and 11 go together in a really complementary way where if you were on the side of the road with a flat tire, who would you call? Probably your closest friend to be like, I'm in a bind, come get me. But also on a Friday night, when you have time, you call that person to be like, let's hang out. To me, that's what 10 and 11 are. I feel like they show the different conversations we should be having with God. When we do the step 11 work of connecting with God each day and feeling his presence in our life, we can recognize his power and that he's there and he's on our side. That makes it a whole lot easier to call on him when we're dysregulated in step 10 and say, I'm in crisis. Can you take this from me? I can trust that he's going to show up. And vice versa. The guy who shows up and rescues me from my fear and my resentments, that's the guy I want to hang out with on Friday nights. So 10 and 11, I feel like complement each other. Also, step 11 for me, that taking that time each day to build that relationship with God, I feel like is like ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure thing, because that helps to make me a lot more resilient to the things that would have normally dysregulated me and been moving me into the step 10 and 12. I don't sponsor, but I do share my message. Obviously today I'm on this call. That's for me, that's what 12 is about, is just making sure I'm sharing with other people the experiences I'm having, that God is doing good things in my life.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that, Gwen. Have another question that came in from our live audience, an anonymous question. Which 12-step group are you in? It sounds like it's very big book and God focused.
Yeah. So, great question. So I've been in a different, I will say I'm not specific to a specific home group right now. Because yeah, it is a God focus and it is big book focus, because for me, I felt like there was a lot of kind of dysfunction happening in the 12-step culture of the programs that I was a part of. And the more involved I got in the big book, and the closer I got with God, the more aware I became of some of the chronic dysfunction that was happening in the game of telephone, that I felt like kind of diluted God's ability to show up and do the thing the big book was promising he could do for me. And so I would say right now I'm not super affiliated with any particular group, but yes, very much anchored to the big book and very much anchored to God, because that's what I have found that works. And like I said, the more focused I got on that, the more dissatisfied I was becoming with the groups that I was participating in. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Gwen. I kind of want to go there for just a minute. You mentioned that you were in a 12-step fellowship through your church, that there was a workbook in, and then you were introduced to the big book, and a little bit about that. What did that process look like? How did you get introduced to the big book, and what was your attitude towards that as you were introduced to that process?
Yes, I sure wish it would have happened a whole lot earlier. It would have changed my life a whole lot sooner. I was introduced, yeah, I went to a fellowship that was specific. So I struggle with food. I was eating myself to death, literally. I went to an Overeaters Anonymous fellowship in the beginning, and they have their own book, Overeaters Anonymous. They have their own book that was based on the 12, like the original Alcoholics Anonymous book that they've kind of translated into, their program. And then I found out my church was having one that was not specific and used some more like faith-based terms. I'm like, well, I'll try that. So I went there for a long time, but then went back to like, I really need to be with the people who get that I'm going through something like that specific to this food thing. And so I went back, and it was when I went back after hitting my last rock bottom and becoming suicidal, that I ended up, I had never heard of like, I remembered when I first started Overeaters Anonymous, I would see like the list of groups I could participate in on like Tuesday at this time, Wednesday at this time, Thursday at this time, all these different locations across town. And there was one that was like big book focus, but I didn't really get it. I didn't know what it was. Nobody had explained it to me. And so, it was all, I didn't know anything about that. But then when I went back, like I said, this was 15, almost 20 years later, when I went back, I just was praying to find the right sponsor for me, because I was afraid. I was worried, like, if I have someone policing me, that's a trigger. If I have to give up stuff, that's a trigger. Like, but I had to do what I had to do to live. And so I was just praying I'd find the right sponsor. And somebody mentioned one time in a Facebook group I was a part of, hey, I'm a recovered, available sponsor looking to find the right person. And we connected, and she was the first one to describe to me, like, I just used the big book. So we're just going to focus on doing the steps. I'm going to teach you how to do the steps. And she was the one who directed me to read the book. She's like, read these first 8 chapters before you even decide if you want me to sponsor you. And so she directed me, instead of her coming right in and being like, I'm going to teach you how to do this program. I'm going to teach you how to do this. And here's what to do. Before she gave me any instructions on how she thought I should be moving through my addiction, she's like, read the big book. then talk to me. If you still want to move forward, we'll move forward. And her directing me to read the big book and me reading the big book changed over 15 years of misunderstandings I'd had about the 12 steps and the program, and cleared everything up for me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. All right, have a couple more questions that have come in from the live audience. First one here is, can you give a real life example of what it looks like to you to giving your will, your life over to God? And here's an addition to that. If you know you have been selfish and you need to change something, how do you give that to God? What does that process look like?
That's such a great question. And it's so funny because every time I'm like, give it to God, give it to God, people are like, yeah, but how do you do that? So thanks so much for asking that question. So for me, this is how I look at it. But also I think the other part of that question really, and I would say that what you're asking me is how to do it. But I think also what you would like to know is, how does it happen? And I will tell you, I know my part. I know what to do in order to start that conversation with God. I don't know how he does his part, but I know how to start my side of the conversation so he can show up and do the heavy lifting. So, how do I give things to God? I ask him to take them. So for me, I will give you a real life example. Let's see. I mean, I mentioned kind of last night. Here's an example. I'll go back to the one where I was having that, thought of something I wanted. Hold on. There's so many examples. I do this every day. Let me just say this. I'll say it more generally, and then I will give like a more specific example. If you don't know what you're holding, then the place to start is to say, God, what am I holding? And the script that we have in like step 10 and 11, those are great for helping us to initiate a two-way prayer with God. So when I was doing my step 11s, I thought, I have to answer these questions and send them to a sponsor. Where was I fearful today, resentful, all these things, write them down, send them to my sponsor. Well, then that wasn't doing a whole lot for me. So instead I paused and I'm like, I'm going to look at this as a two-way prayer. And I'm not going to say these are questions I'm answering to tell somebody. These are questions I'm asking because I don't know. I know that my addiction is showing up all day. And I know it's the byproduct of my fears and resentments and all that stuff, but I'm not really sure what the correlation is or the connection. So instead, I'm just going to say, okay, God, where was I selfish today? Where was I resentful? Where was I all these things? And then thoughts would come to my mind, and usually circumstances. I would remember, this situation or that situation. And I remember like, oh yeah, I was being really selfish. Oh, I was really being like, people pleasing was a big one. I started to unravel that because I realized like, whoa, people pleasing. I'm not really being nice to people. I'm motivated by fear. I'm afraid they're going to think bad things about me. I'm becoming resentful. I hate them. I hate myself because I did something I didn't want to do. I'm motivated by selfishness because I'm trying to control circumstances and how people view me. I'm motivated by dishonesty because I'm saying yes when I mean to say, when I don't actually want to do stuff. And so for me, I started to realize how all of those things they were moving through my life and creating experiences that I didn't like, I didn't want to have. And so for me, it started with asking God, where are these things happening? And then be like, can you remove this fear? Can you remove this resentment? And then now, in step 10, we're trying to do that in real time. And so that is very much what it looks like, is just the conversation of like, either I know I'm dysregulated and why. So I'll be like, God, I'm mad. Can you please remove this from me? And then I'm not sitting around and waiting for it to be lifted from my heart. Sometimes that happens. So how do I do my part? My part is simple. I ask God to do it. I ask God to lift it. I identify it. And then I say, God, this isn't serving me. Now I will give you a real example. So there was an example I had from a year ago. Just over a year ago, my then boyfriend, we're married now. We had a situation over a weekend where we just had something come up and my feelings were really hurt. And then we were going to talk about it the next day. And so then I recognized that night, I was like, I'm really stuck in fear. I'm afraid like maybe I can't trust him. I'm afraid this is going to happen again. I'm afraid all of these things. I was really resentful. I was mad. He did this and he did that. And I was really struggling. And I knew from doing this over and over, those aren't things I can afford to hold on to. So I knelt in prayer and I was like, God, I'm mad. I'm mad for these reasons. And they're good. I mean, usually we feel these things for good reasons. I'm mad for these reasons. I'm afraid because of these reasons. but I also know they're not serving me, and they are keeping me in selfish thinking because now I'm consumed with my fear and resentment. So will you please lift them from me? Will you please help me to be forgiving? Will you please help me to, lift those from my heart so I can just keep my heart reserved for the good things, happiness, joy, serenity, certainty. And then as soon as I said that prayer, so that's how I do my part. I identify the thing I'm holding, or if I don't know what I'm holding, I ask God, what am I holding? Let him tell me. Then I say, can you take it? And then God shows up and does the heavy lifting. So ask. And then that night, the way God did the heavy lifting was that once I asked him to remove that from me, I started to have in my mind, almost like this movie playing across my mind, all of the times that I'd shown up and loved my boyfriend. And he'd been delighted by it, and I'd been fulfilled. And immediately, simultaneously, too, my heart softened. I was no longer afraid. I was no longer mad at him. I was able to forgive. To me, that was significant for two reasons. One, I was able to forgive him before he had understood or apologized. That was work I was able to work out with God alone. And then the other thing that was significant to me was that what came to my mind was not the times that my boyfriend had been nice to me. It had been the times that I had shown kindness and love to him. And so, and that I think kind of goes into step 12 stuff, the value of sharing and witnessing. But anyway, I say that to say that I think when people ask me, how do you give things to God? They're really asking two questions. How do we do it? But how does it happen? And how it happens is we open our mouths and ask God to take it. And so to bring, to be a little more self-aware of saying, well, what's wrong with me in the first place? What am I holding? Because sometimes I only know I'm dysregulated, either because I know I'm uncomfortable or because I'm having a craving. If I'm having a craving, there's something somewhere I'm holding. So I pause. I'm like, okay, God, what am I holding then? And then I go through the process of identifying the fear, resentment, selfishness, and or dishonesty, usually an assortment of it. And then I say, oh, that's what it is. Cool. I see it. And I have good reasons for it. But it's not really serving me. It's just going to put me in a place where I'm making crappy choices from a place of being uncomfortable. So can you take it from me and restore me back to a place of peace? And like I said, then what happens next? Well, sometimes there's a miraculous lifting. The feeling is gone. Sometimes there's a thought that will come to my mind that will clear it up. Sometimes somebody will come into my path who will give me added perspective that clears it up. Sometimes nothing works. And I'm like, well, I'm still feeling crappy. I'm still having a craving. I'm still whatever. And in that moment, I'm like, if I don't know what else to do, serve, because that's going to create movement, and that will move me to a place where I'm not like focused in self, and that creates a miraculous lifting.
Yeah, thank you, Gwen. Got a couple more questions that have come in. We'll try and get to them quickly so we can wrap this up here. How do you not focus on the food and wait during this process?
It's hard. I mean, not now because I don't live that in that place anymore. But to me, I think it was just recognizing that the food and the weight only is a reflection of what's going on with me emotionally and spiritually. And if I can really believe that that is true, then it's easier for me to focus exclusively on the emotional and spiritual work I'm doing with God, trusting that the weight and the food will take care of itself once I take care of this. It's kind of like this. If you had a pipe burst in your house, what was the very first thing you would do? Would you grab a mop or would you fix the pipe? For me, I recognize that if I'm obsessing about the food, or my addiction, whatever it is, if I'm obsessing about the food and all of that, I'm just grabbing a mop. So in order to fix the problem, I need to focus on repairing the pipe. What's creating the mess in the first place? And it's the spiritual stuff that I have to work out with God. So I just dial that in over and over and just remember, as much as I want to grab a mop, as much as that water is flooding my house, that's not the problem. I got to fix the pipe. I got to fix the pipe. And any moments I'm spending trying to mop are just taking away from the time I need to be spending on fixing the pipe. And that's what's urgent.
Yeah, thank you, Gwen. And that reminds me of a phrase from the Big Book that says something like, "When I straighten out spiritually, the physical and the mental follow." And I think that's how that works with that in my life. All right, and next question is from another anonymous member, and this is a question I wanted to ask you too, and I'm going to be blunt with it. Why don't you sponsor? You have something that people need. Why don't you sponsor?
Thank you. So I share my message as much as I can. I actually spend a lot of time sharing my message. I have a newsletter, like there's different things that I'm trying to share. So I spend my time in the spirit of sponsorship, but not one-on-one. And the reason why I don't do it one-on-one is because I feel like it really limits how many people I can talk to at once. So I love being on here today and talking to several people at once. Because I feel like there's so many people who need the message of help and recovery, especially when I feel like there's a lot. And no offense, I love 12-step. I love 12-step so much. The 12-step program sometimes kind of adopt some other practices that make it hard to move through. At least for me, I was stuck in a 12-step room for over 15 years. And so for me, it was about dialing in the big book and the principles of the 12 steps. And so I feel like doing it one person at a time limits how many people I get to tell. So yeah, that's why.
All right, thank you. And if you wouldn't mind someone asking, hey, can you get me like a link to the newsletter, how people can get involved with that, and I can put that in the show notes of the podcast. I can put it up in the WhatsApp group, the Rico 12 WhatsApp group, so people can track that down. So just get that to me after our conversation here. So before we go into closing reading, do you have any final words of wisdom for us, Gwen?
Yes, I just want to say thanks so much for hosting and letting me share today. I also wanted to say, when in doubt, serve. It creates movement. And just understand that the 12 steps, all it's trying to do is get you to God. He'll know what to do with you. So when in doubt, just like get to God, get to God, get to God. He'll know what to do with you. He'll know what to tell you to do next.
Awesome. Thank you, Gwen. And that was a great Rico 12 weekly speaker meeting. If we missed your question or if you have more questions, consider joining our WhatsApp community. You can email me at rico12pod@gmail.com to get in there, and we can ask those questions, answer other people's questions that may come in. Gwen, if you'd like to join that, I can get you connected in that WhatsApp community. If you haven't already done so out there, please consider rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts. It's a powerful way to work step 12. And next Friday, we get to hear from Sharon E., another first-time Rico 12 speaker. Sharon's been sober in AA for nearly 40 years, and her topic will be the topic of we deal with our addictions in the order in which they are killing us. And that's a good one for people like me who are multi-disciplinary addicts. It'll be good, I'm sure about that. So please stay tuned. If you're not on the email list, getting this information, get on that email list. You can do that at rico12.com/join us. You can go to rico12.com and find that there. Now let's launch off into the rest of our day with the third step prayer that Gwen will say for us.
Okay. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gwen. All right, everybody. Remember, there is one that has all power. That one is God. May you find God now. Keep coming back. Let's work it as we go down this, as we trudge this path of happy destiny. Work it. You are worth it.
There was a man put his hand by the side of his mouth, and he wanted to scream, but the sound never came out. So he reached for the bottle to wash the pain away, 'cause what he wanted so badly was to live a different way. And all of his problems and all of his pain filled up the puddle and rose with the rain. His ship kept on sinking to the bottom of the lake. For certain that he was just a fake, just a fake. Was a man put his hand by the side of his mouth, and he wanted to share, but only lies ever came out. So the truth that he yearned for shriveled up and died. And all of his problems, and all of his pain filled up the puddle, rose with the rain. Ship kept on sinking, bottom of the lake. He knew for certain that he was just a fake, just a side of his mouth as he read from the book, only truth spilled out. So he reached for a power to help him through the night. 'Cause what lives in the darkness dies in the light. Yeah, what lives in the darkness dies.